All right, welcome to part B. Let's take a look at Alexander Hamilton and his program for the United States. So, George Washington became president, and you really couldn't have a better man for the job. And that first United States president, and he fit the bill perfectly as far as his character, his humility, the respect that he had earned from his peers, and his experience, of course, during the Revolutionary War as the commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army. A man who did not lust after power like so many victorious commanders in history, but a man who knew what his proper place was and sought to set a pristine example for the office of the executive in those critical early years in the 1790s. Well, Washington, one of many precedents that he establishes is to create a cabinet. Appointments of advisors to advise him on a myriad of topics. One of those, of course, was the topic of finance. And for this position, for Secretary of the Treasury, Washington appoints a young man named Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton came from very humble beginnings. He was born out of wedlock. His father was Scotsman, and his mother was half British, half French. He was born on a very tiny island in the Caribbean Sea called Nevis. But as a young man, he came to the North American mainland and ended up serving as a personal aide to George Washington during the Revolutionary War, in which he earned the confidence of his commander. And then later, he became one of the more successful lawyers in New York City. And when the time came for the Constitutional Convention, he was in attendance. He was only 31 years old at the time. But he played a key role in pushing for a stronger, firmer, more dignified national government, and then returned home to New York to defend ratification, and was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers together with James Madison. He's only 34 years old when he is made Secretary of the Treasury. He's a brilliant man, extraordinarily smart, very, very gifted in finance and economics. He was a forward-thinking man. He had a vision for the United States, and the way he saw the United States, he saw a continent, a country, which as of this point only went as far as the Mississippi River, filled with tremendous resources. He called the United States a, quote, Hercules in the cradle. But it's yet in the cradle. What it needs to mature and grow into its full potential is capital, right? It needs capital. It needs finance in order to develop these resources, in order to establish manufacturing. Hamilton is a big proponent of, in order to take America and become one of the world's great powers. Hamilton has a vision for American greatness that could adequately be described as nationalistic. Hamilton is a nationalist. He's an American nationalist, and he believes that his vision, his program, will take America to these great heights, a sort of extravagant prosperity. And Hamilton believes he has the idea of what to do. Hamilton, first of all, argues in favor of having a national debt. A national debt. And the reason for this, we've talked about this a bit before when we discussed the Bank of England. Remember the financial revolution, the Bank of England in 1694. Hamilton looks at the British example, and he wants this for the United States. Now, yes, it's true. Hamilton was a patriot. He supported the war for independence. He wanted to separate from Britain. However, now that we're separate, he thinks the Brits actually have a pretty good model, and we can harness that British those British ideas and innovations, but this time for American interests. And so he looks at the British example of a national debt. He says, this is brilliant. Because what you're doing is you're attaching the moneyed interest in the country, those with money, money lenders, financiers, and you're attaching their interest to that of the U.S. government, which provides stability and support to the government. Not to mention the fact that if you build your own credit, if you are credit worthy, the government that is, in times of emergency you can borrow, no problem. Let's take a look again at Britain versus France, on the other hand, which didn't have that credit worthiness, didn't have a central bank, and was thus unable to weather some of the greater storms of the 18th century. Part of this debt program, Hamilton says, look, okay, yeah, we've got a lot of federal debt outstanding at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. But in order to increase confidence in the government's credit, Hamilton promised to pay off that national debt at face value. So U.S. securities were circulating below par. Hamilton says, no, we're going to pay at face value, boost the nation's credit. And then Hamilton also says, look, we've got all this state debt. This isn't good. Hamilton pushes forward a very controversial plan for the federal government to assume that state debt. So, for example, Massachusetts had a lot of debt. Hamilton said, it's okay, you're in a union now, we're a national government, the federal government will assume your debt for you. This then ended up raising the national debt from $54 million to $75 million. But it also eliminated that state debt. This had the consequence of binding the states closer to the federal government and creating, again, a stronger bonds of unity. Now, there were some states who howled at this proposal because some states like Massachusetts had a lot of debt. Other states like Virginia had very little debt. And so this struck many of those states that had little debt, particularly in the South, as unfair. And so the compromise was that the District of Columbia would be placed just north of Virginia on the Potomac River. That wasn't determined but until this controversy as a result of that controversy. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much. But we have all this national debt. You need new taxes to fund that debt. And so taxes in the form of revenue tariffs, but also taxes in the form of an excise tax on whiskey, for example, was the most notorious one. Ended up sparking a rebellion in Pennsylvania in 1794 called the Whiskey Rebellion. But new taxes. And then Hamilton was a big believer in industry and manufacturing. He wanted cities. He wanted factories. He saw what was happening in Britain. Britain has been undergoing an industrial revolution since about 1750. Hamilton wants that for the United States, and so Hamilton proposes subsidizing American industry. And then later, people run with this idea and support protective tariffs for American industry. So, quite a plan, a very controversial plan. But the most controversial part of all, Hamilton said, I want a bank. I want a bank. And here, fierce opposition arises. Hamilton, in December of 1790, puts forward a bill for a Bank of the United States. Bank of the United States. What is this bank? Well, first of all, it's a private bank. It has private shareholders. Now, the federal government happened to also own some of those shares, but it's run by a private board of directors, and it makes a profit. This bank will also issue banknotes, paper currency, redeemable on demand in silver or gold coin. One of the most controversial parts of this charter, of this bill, was it gave the banking of the United States a monopoly charter for 20 years, meaning the federal government could not charter any other bank during that 20-year period. During that 20-year period, only the Bank of the United States would have the right to a federal charter and to having branches in multiple states. So, for example, though the headquarters of the Bank of the United States would be in Philadelphia, the Bank of the United States would have branches in Boston, New York, Charleston, Newport, Rhode Island, all over the Union. In addition to all of this, and this was Hamilton's justification, these last 2 points, the U.S. Treasury will deposit all federal funds in the Bank of the United States, where they would earn interest on the deposit, and then the bank would utilize that money through fractional reserves. Why was this necessary in Hamilton's view? Well, the U.S. Treasury collects tax money through tariffs or through an excise tax. What's it going to do with that money? Where are you going to put it? Hamilton said, let's deposit those funds in the bank. And so it accepts Treasury deposits, federal funds. But then lastly, this will also operate as an institution that will lend money to the federal government, right, at interest, of course, but will, again, what is the advantage of a bank? A bank can pool capital together, and by pooling capital together is able to, through economies of scale, diversify risk and lend more money than maybe an individual money lender would be willing or able to do. Whew, big plan here for a bank from Alexander Hamilton. So there's the coins. You still have the Coinage Act. Well, the Coinage Act actually hasn't even been passed yet because Hamilton introduces his bill in December of 1790. But this bank will issue banknotes, redeemable in specie on demand, and will operate on a fractional reserve basis. This is actually a later Bank of the United States note from 1827, I believe that is. I was unable to find a banknote from the first period, but a similar look here as the original. What's Hamilton's model here? The Bank of England. And it's a little different from the Bank of England, but there's no doubt as to the parallels here. And Hamilton, again, is an admirer of the British system. And this is what Hamilton wants for the United States. Now, the big, obvious question comes up when this bill is introduced. Where in the Constitution does it say that Congress can charter a bank? There's nothing in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to charter a bank, or any corporation for that matter. It's not there. How does Hamilton respond to this? Hamilton says, well, actually it is there. It's implied in the Constitution. What does that mean? Well, it's not explicitly or expressly enumerated, but there are implied powers there. He points to Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power, this is at the end of Section 8, to make all laws which shall be, what? Necessary and proper. Necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And what are those foregoing powers? Collect taxes, borrow money, coin money, regulate the value of money, but especially collecting taxes and borrowing money. Hamilton says we need a place to deposit those funds, and we need an institution to borrow money from. And so it's implied in Article 1, Section 8 that Congress can charter a bank. A bit of a spurious argument, perhaps. Hamilton's very clever. Hamilton is a genius in a way, and the argument that he constructs in defense of the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States was ingenious as well, but is controversial, immensely controversial. People say this is abusive. This is clearly not what the Constitution intended. This is an abuse of the Constitution. And Hamilton says, again, no, it's not. It's implied. Hamilton has a view of the Constitution that's a lot more expansive, a lot more elastic, you may say. And Hamilton is willing to flex a little bit in order to get what he wants. Now, what's interesting about this is in 1790 that he proposes this bill. The Constitutional Convention was just a couple of years prior, and the ratification debates were going on just a year and a half ago. Did this idea just appear out of nowhere? And Hamilton's like, oh, I never thought of this before. Yeah, we should have a bank. Well, of course not. Hamilton and many others had given thought to this. Why didn't they put it in the Constitution then? Well, the Constitution already had great difficulty getting ratified. Almost wasn't ratified. It was ratified, but it almost didn't make it. There was a lot of opposition to ratifying the Constitution. There were people who worried that it was creating an all-powerful federal government. Do you think that ratification would have been any easier if there had been a clause in Article 1, Section 8 giving Congress the power to charter a national bank, a for-profit private national bank? You tell me what you think. I would say no. Would not have had any easier time, and perhaps that might have been enough to kill it. And so they waited. And in 1790, Hamilton introduces the idea. And again, cleverly uses this argument. Well, it's going to have a lot of opposition. And so political parties will form. There's nothing about political parties in the Constitution, but almost as if just by nature they appear. Hamilton and his supporters will be called the Federalist Party. The opponents, those who oppose Hamilton's financial program and the Bank of the United States, call themselves the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who himself was one of the primary authors of the Constitution and disagreed with Hamilton on the constitutionality of the bank. So for Part C, we'll take a look at Jefferson's dissent. See you there.